Welcome to the Whiskey, Jazz, and Leadership Podcast. Subscribe now so you don't miss a drop of straight talk you can't get anywhere else. We discuss the whiskeys to drink, music to listen to, and what it really takes to be an effective leader. I'm your host, Galen Bingham, the leadership strategist. Tonight's guest, professional keynote speaker and collaborative problem solver, Matt Lehrman. Hey, what you drinking? I love it. I love it.
Did you have a similar kind of epiphany? Was there a moment for you that got you to that point?
You know, I think the road that I'm on, just this idea of not having someone else's corporation behind me, which sounds ludicrous when you think about it, because we add value individually. I've said a number of times that even in business to business, it's still people working with people. So it's not a company adding value to another company. It's a person in that company adding value to another person in a different company. But yet we often, and I know I fell into this, get confused into thinking, can I do this without that brand, without that Fortune 100 brand behind me? And the answer is yes. And it's hard, but we can do hard things. So that's my answer to that. But I do have another question I want to ask, because I have heard of a lot of people, I know of a lot of people who have run marathons, but I've never had I've never had a conversation with them. I know of them. I've never had a conversation with them. But one thing has always occurred to me when I have talked to people who have not run a marathon. They always say it's 26 miles. And the thing that occurs to me is that last 0.2 that's probably got to be harder than any of the other 26 miles. Tell me about the last 0.2.
That is a really great question. I remember that last 0.2, and I remember the mantra that I had to repeat to myself that I had been using all throughout my training. They tell you when you train for a marathon that you don't do anything during the marathon that you haven't trained for. First off, let me tell you how I screwed that up. So here I'm running the Dublin Marathon, and what do you wear? I know I can't forget that little bib thing that you wear. And the running coach had told us to write our names in marker on the front of it so that people could cheer you on by name. And so I've written Matt across it. And as I'm running in the first mile of running the marathon, I'm hearing, "Go, Matt, good on ya." And every time someone yelled my name, I threw my arms up in the air and went, "Yay!" Galen, at the end of the first mile, my arms hurt so bad because I hadn't trained to be raising my arms, every 5 seconds while I was running. And so for the next 5 miles or 10 miles, I ran with my arms stiff at my sides because I couldn't barely lift them anymore. When I finally got to that last 0.2, the only thing that was left was just to repeat my mantra. I won't even tell you what it is because it's a personal thing, but I just kept repeating it, and you dig deep. You know who you are. You dig deep, and you say, I'm running on determination. That's the only thing that's left. And you know what, Galen? Once you learn to tap into that, you can apply it to everything else in your life. I had no idea I had that kind of determination in me. Now, to someone who's been in the military, to someone who's been a first responder, this is obvious to them. They learned how to do this early in their lives. I imagine there are a lot of athletes, even recreational athletes, who know how to do this. That was never my thing. So when I found it for myself, incredibly empowering. And that's what I try to bring out in the people with whom I work as well. That if I can empower them, if I can help them reach into their capacity to move forward, despite the odds, despite all the internal part that says this is hard, then I've done my job. And I feel great gratification for that.
Wow. Now, hey, so I want to get into this work that you're doing now. because when we first talked about it, it seemed like it was going to be similar to what I had always known you to do. And that was, to facilitate conversations from a stage. And the more we talked, the more it sounded like it was going to be a lot more intense than anything that I have ever known you to do. And quite honestly, it gave me pause because I have famously said that I'm not afraid of having any conversation with anyone at any time about any subject. But you're literally leading conversations where people are coming in entrenched in one side or the other, and they are blindly focused on their belief that they are right. And you're managing that conversation. If that doesn't fit into the definition of courage, I don't know what does. Tell me about, first of all, why did you decide to run blindly into this kind of work? And then what kind of courage does it take for you to stand in the gap between two people who believe that the other side has lost their mind?
I'll be honest with you. I have never thought of that as an act of courage on my part. I think the courage is for people who have strong opinions to put those opinions in check for just a minute to be able to listen to someone else. And not everyone is willing or able, perhaps, to do that. It is a choice. Generosity is a choice. In a moment when someone says something to you that you just viscerally disagree with, it is a choice to not jump down their throat and call them names and to say all kinds of terrible things and to lecture them and to be judgmental. It's a choice to be able to say, tell me more. Help me understand the experience, the education, the insight that you have that makes that a reasonable perspective. Tell me what you mean by that. Help me understand the implications of that. All I have to do is just ask, are you willing to have a conversation? There are plenty of people who will say, I'm not willing to have a conversation. And if that's the case, then it's over. It's kind of like, if you go to a bazaar somewhere and you want to buy something and you say to the whoever's selling it, is the price negotiable? If they say no, that price is firm, then you're done. You choose to buy it or not, but that's it. But if their response is, what would you offer? Then game on. Then that it's okay to offer. It's not offensive to offer a different price and to enter into that little dance. The same is true in these kinds of courageous conversations. Those people who have made up their mind and are not open to the conversation, I just have to say, I respect your ability, your right to your opinion, and I choose to move on. We're not going to engage. But to the person who says, I'm willing to talk about it, well, then the world opens up. The world of possibilities opens up. It's not a guarantee that we're going to find an agreement. It is just the possibility that we can talk about it. And there's a wonderful quote. Mr. Rogers has this wonderful quote that if it's human, it's mentionable. And if it's mentionable, it's manageable. I love the concept of this, that if we can talk about it, then who knows where we could go. But if we don't talk about it, if we make assumptions about each other, or if worse, if we talk at each other, well, then terrible things are going to happen. And I would add to that, that also concerns me a great deal about social media and even mainstream media these days, which are monetizing anger and outrage and holding people's attention because of the anger and the outrage and making money off of it, as opposed to actually having a productive dialogue where people are opening up and actually considering changing their minds because they're hearing what other people have to say. So the courageous part is not me I'm an architect, if you will. I just create a framework that brings together people who already are willing to talk. The courage is for those people who are willing to open themselves up to a conversation.
I want to run a quote by you, and this has been one of my favorite quotes. And this is by Noel M. Tichy and Andrew McGill. And they say that given the choice between being in control or being effective, we often choose being in control, because being effective means that we must be in touch with changing reality and be willing to change with it. It requires the monitoring of our own hypocrisy and the willingness to close our own hypocrisy gaps. And I see that in social media all the time, where people are unwilling to evaluate whether what they believe is true or not. Because if what they believe happens not to be true, then they're left with a choice. Either they change what they believe or they dig down and go deeper. And so rather than struggle with that choice, it would be easier for me to just shut down the conversation. And I'm curious if in the work that you do, if you ever notice people who give you that look in their eye where they realize, hey, wait a second, what I believe might not still be true. But rather than go into this deeper, I'm just gonna dig down. I'm gonna reinforce my position rather than continue this area where I may have to deal with my own hypocrisy. Have you ever experienced that, and how do you deal with that?
All the time. And there's another quote. You and I can probably throw quotes back and forth at each other all day.
Yeah.
And I forget the name of, I think it was a German psychologist who came up with, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's people aren't rational. People are rationalizers. As human beings, we don't quantify and look for the truth, the objective truth in everything. We have narratives. We have narratives about who we are, our family history, our culture, our society, the way things are, how they got there. We tell ourselves a story. And then we take the facts or the situation that's presented to us and we run it through that narrative. And we ask, well, how do we interpret this given this sense? I'll give you an example. I have a podcast of my own. It's called Tell Me More, in which I bring together people who disagree about things. And in the first season, we were talking about, I think it was gender inequality and the wage gap. And one of my guests was a woman who said, my grandfather came to this country with nothing, and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. And if he can do it, anyone can. That's her narrative. And that means that if you want to argue that there are people in this country who, for example, whose ancestors were brought here as slaves, and who, as a result of systemic discrimination and laws that were legal at the time, were barred from getting an education or owning homes or doing these kinds of things, and their descendants didn't receive the kind of inherited wealth that her grandfather was able to pass down to his family. To argue that is not just to argue the rational nature, the facts of that. It is to step on the cherished memory of her beloved grandfather. And that we are rationalizers. And so we have to be sensitive in the moment that when people tell us the story of what they believe, not the facts as they know them, but the narrative with which they process it, that there's a lot more going on here. And so I'm with you completely. The whole idea of bringing people together is that we have to understand not just that we're in the same place at the same time having this conversation, but that we got there through wildly different and in some cases completely unfair and divergent ways. We still might be here and you might still say, yeah, but here we are today. Well, the momentum, the trajectory, all of that can be wildly different for what that means from my family to yours, or from me personally to you. And in that moment, that tell me more is about help me understand how you got here is different than how I got here. Because when we appreciate that, then we can have a conversation about how do we move forward together.
And see, and for me, that's where the courage on your part comes in, because there are so many conversations that I would love to have. However, in today's environment, to even take a position that you don't understand could categorize you in a way that might be unfair, but it could damage your entire career. So there are certain things. One of the courses that I took in undergrad, I attended Southern Nazarene University. It's a Christian university in Bethany, Oklahoma. And because it was a Christian university, I didn't realize that Nazarene was a whole nother discipline. It was a whole nother faith. I figured, Jesus was from Nazareth. He was a Nazarene. Cool, sign me up. But it was a whole nother doctrine. And one of the requirements is that we had to take 3 courses in religion. And one of the courses that I think about often was this course on world religions. And we had to look at all these different religions, and we had to understand, why did so many people, millions of people, believe what they believed? But we couldn't use the Bible to pass judgment because they may not believe in the Bible, right? So you can't use the Bible to say that they're wrong because whatever. You're just trying to understand, what was it about that doctrine that caused millions of people to believe that one thing. And it led for some incredible conversations. But in today's society, I don't feel like we can have those conversations, because if I say, I don't understand transgender, because it's just so foreign from anything that I've ever experienced or anything that I've ever thought about. I'd love to have a conversation with someone who is transgender, just to understand what led them to such a final decision that they wanted to make this change. I'm not necessarily saying that their change was wrong. Their change is just different than anything that I would have considered. And I just really would like to understand. But in today's society, I don't know that it takes courage to have that kind of conversation, for fear that you might be labeled, hey, you're insensitive, you're this, you're that. I'm just curious. And so that's why I keep coming back to the courage to hold that kind of conversation. Because in reality, and I tell this story often, the truth of the matter is, I don't like the New York Yankees. Hate the New York Yankees. Can't stand the New York Yankees. And you know why I hate the New York Yankees? I hate the New York Yankees because my dad couldn't stand the New York Yankees. Just no redeeming qualities in his mind for the New York Yankees. And you know why he couldn't stand the New York Yankees? Because my grandfather oh my gosh, he would just go into fits anytime he would hear anyone saying anything positive about the New York Yankees. And so before my grandfather passed away, I asked him, why is it that we hate the New York Yankees? And he said, oh, well, it's very simple. I used to love the New York Yankees. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite players played for the New York Yankees, but then they traded him outside of my radio listening area. And from that point on, I just hated the New York Yankees because I could no longer hear about my favorite player playing baseball. And that just got passed down through generations to the point where we don't even ask questions anymore, because now if you say something positive about the New York Yankees, now you're talking about my dad and my granddad, and I don't appreciate that.
That's right. We inherit a narrative and we carry it forward. But let me ask you the question a different way. When I launched the podcast about, a little over 2 years ago, and I said this would be the podcast of courageous conversations, and I was kind of thinking, what could we be doing? What would be a courageous conversation? I reached out to a professor who I knew here at Arizona State University, an African-American man who I had known from prior work that I had done in the nonprofit. And I reached out to him because I respected him so much. And I said, hey, here's my concept. I just wanted to share it with you. Maybe you'd like to be a guest at some point. And I said, and these are the kinds of topics. We're going to do courageous conversations. We're talking about racism. We're going to talk about all these things. And he did me such a huge favor, but he was rather sharp with me. And he said, what makes you think that a bunch of white people talking about racism is a courageous conversation? Black people on this continent have been talking about racism and discrimination for 400 years. So you tell me how you get to call this a courageous conversation because you're just picking it up now. And I really had to think hard about this. So that definition that I gave you earlier, where I said, it's not about, the military, it's not about standing ground, it's about being openness. That was a direct response to him saying, this is about being open-minded and being able to listen to other people's perspectives, because it's not the topic that's courageous. Racism is not a courageous topic. It's an imperative. It's a fact. It's a thing that exists, and it has existed for a long time. The courageous part, and we did an episode on this in my first season, which I titled White Responsibility. And purposefully, I only invited white guests, 3 of them, to join me for the conversation. And we only talked about what our responsibility as white people is towards the cause of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I had people from different parts of the political spectrum having this conversation, but it was us owning it. And even that's not courageous. The courageous part was us being open to the conversation and us inviting our listeners to be open to the conversation, the willingness to listen to something with the idea that you might let it change your mind. That's the only courage that I'm really interested in this moment. And we need a lot more of that kind of courage, that kind of openness and vulnerability and willingness to listen to each other. And that's what I've devoted my career to from now on.
Wow. You're reminding me of a conversation that I had back, I believe it was the start of season 2, where I talked with Rada Yavovich, another brilliant consultant. She's a coach. She just does a lot of amazing things. But she talked about racism and actually brought me into the conversation at a pace that I wasn't prepared to come into that conversation the way she brought me in. But the way she sized it up is she said that people are inherently uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. And when you broach topics like racism, there's an injustice there that whether folks voice it or not, everyone recognizes that there's an injustice there, and that makes them uncomfortable. And people get uncomfortable being uncomfortable. So rather than go into a situation where I'm going to be uncomfortable, I would rather just not even go in. As a matter of fact, I'm upset at you for raising a topic that is going to make me uncomfortable.
The whole idea of that is so right on. And so here I get invited now to do keynote talks, the opening keynotes for different state municipal associations. And between now and the next 3 months, I am scheduled to give the opening keynotes for at least 10 state municipal associations all across the country, including the League of California Cities, where I'll be speaking to more than 2,000 people. And I use technology in the course of my talk, where people can text message in a keyword and it appears on a big word cloud on my PowerPoint slide in the moment. And I asked the question early in my presentation to fill in the blank. Civic engagement in my community most often leaves people feeling blank. And I have asked this question in 20 or more civic or municipal leagues all over the country, and the answers always seem to come back the same. And I don't sandbag this. I don't set this up in any way. How do people feel about their civic engagement as voiced by mayors and city council members and city managers? The words frustrated, angry, and confused tend to dominate the list. And I didn't set that up. That's the audience telling me this is how people in their community feel. And then the next question I ask, and we do the word cloud again, is how do they deserve to feel? How do you want them to feel? And the words that the audience tells me are connected, respected, and heard. And because those messages come from the audience itself, I don't have to be the sage on the stage who says, this is my brilliance, guys, here you go. It comes out of them. I'm a facilitator. It comes out of them. And if they say, yes, people are frustrated, angry, and confused, and we want them to be connected, respected, and heard, then I can help them move their communities from conflict to conversation. That's the name of my keynote. But they have to own the current state and the desired state. That's courageous for them. If they own that, if they recognize their own personal responsibility, then I have done my job as a speaker to give them that spark, that motivation that lets them internalize that and bring it back into their own communities. That's the kind of local leadership we need.
Oh, I love it, man. And for me, that really does epitomize what I think of when I think of jazz, in that there is no way for you to know ahead of time the areas that you're going to be getting into. You probably have an idea. You probably have a concept. You probably have a couple of key things that you're likely going to talk about, but you can't know what they're going to put on that word cloud. You can't know what one side is going to say in that conversation and how that's going to trigger or not trigger the other side. You've got to be in the moment. And for me, that is jazz. That is trusting your skills, trusting your abilities to manage the situation and to facilitate the conversation. I keep going back to what my man Miles Davis said when he said that in order to be a great jazz musician, you have to learn everything you can and then forget everything that you've learned and then just show up and play. And I don't know, I keep seeing you really enjoying those kinds of spaces, enjoying those kinds of situations. I want to leave this other quote with you, because this is a quote that when I share this quote, I often think of you. This may be one of the spirit connecting notions that has kept you in my contact list. And these are the words of James Michener. And he says, "The master in the art of living makes little distinction between his work and his play, his labor and his leisure, his mind and his body, his education and his recreation, his love and his religion. He hardly knows which is which. He simply pursues his vision of excellence at whatever he does, leaving others to decide whether he's working or playing. To him, he's always doing both." I can imagine that in those moments, seeing you almost as the conductor of an orchestra, and you're bringing in all these different instruments, you're bringing in, you're guiding people through these movements, and I can see you almost smiling and happy, although people watching would be thinking, "Oh my God, what is going on?" But you've got confidence in who you are. You seem to have confidence in who you are, but not from an arrogance standpoint, but a confidence in your ability to stand in the conversation, to stand in the situation and guide people from one side to the other. What's your reaction to that quote, or what's your thoughts?
First off, I'm like so flattered and honored that you think of me that way, and that it seems that that's what's going on. I'm truly touched by that. I will tell you that I am guided by a different quote entirely in those moments, and it's a quote from my dad, who says this. Sometimes I quote him in my speech itself. He says that when he was younger, he thought that humanity was like a loaf of raisin bread, that most people were the bread, but occasionally you ran into some raisins and you just had to deal with them. But as he got older, he came to realize that humanity is just a box of raisins. We are all wrinkly and weird in our own right, and we just got to get used to it. There is no normal. There is no bread. We're just all individuals, and we're all crammed in together, and we got to make the most of it. And, in those moments when all those ideas are flying past, if I have one talent or one skill that permeates this, it's that none of it will throw me. There is a place for every single perspective. Every voice matters. Every voice counts. If I'm facilitating a public input session, the promise I make is that I will type up every single comment to make sure that everything is captured and preserved and can be shared with others. I'm not offended. I'm not opposed to giving everyone a voice. But in the end, my job is to see if we can find a sweet spot, some place where there is general agreement that if all we do is move this, that we have somehow made our community better, our lives better. And if we can find that, then we've accomplished something. And it's not an impossible thing to make ourselves better through collaborative effort.
Man, dude, that is exactly why you are forever on my list of invisible board members, man. And we didn't even talk about your list, but I'm feeling very, very comfortable in saying that this is enough for free. We've shared enough for free with our audience. I've got to bring you into our VIP room, and guys, if you're listening to this, I'm going to suggest to you that this extended conversation with my guests, it's worth the $8 a month. It's really worth it. So, dude, if you've got just a few more minutes, I'd love to bring you into my VIP room so we can continue this conversation with our VIPs, specifically around your invisible board of directors, because you got a pretty wide-ranging members on the board that I would love to have some conversation around.
Pouring some more of my whiskey toffee liqueur. I look forward to joining you in the VIP room.
All right, man. Well, hey, on this side of the velvet rope, though, man, I've just got to say thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for the professionalism and the seriousness with which that you bring the work. And thank you also for what you have meant to me in the maturation of the work that I'm doing, because there were several opportunities and several incredibly brilliant and creative excuses that I was kicking around for why I should probably stop doing what I was daring to do. And you brought the right level of inspiration at the right time. And the only credit I'm going to take for myself is that I had the wisdom to not get up from that table when we sat down and started talking, because that has paid dividends in the career that I have now and that I'm enjoying now. And quite honestly, the work that I'm doing for others. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, for both of us, Galen, thank you so much.
All right. Well, for now, man, raise that glass. And until we get to the other side of the velvet rope, cheers.
Cheers to you.
Hey, it's not too late. Hit that subscribe button so you're sure to catch the next episode. If you're really enjoying the vibe, leave us a review or become a VIP for guest and show exclusives. Cheers.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.